welcome to Celluloid Chronicles, a historical movie podcast. It's Birdy here, ready to give you all the goods on the niche history surrounding Ever After. Just a quick note, we know that our episodes have been delayed lately. As we've said several times before, we have day jobs, families, and everything else, and we know we're trying our best to keep up on things, but I think we're going to focus on quality over quantity, and so moving forward, they're going to come out. Hopefully at least twice a month, but they'll come out and they'll come out well produced. These wonderful episodes. So moving back to Ever After, honestly, most of the central history was already covered in our outtake episode on the Other Boleyn Girl numero uno episode. So I chose to concentrate on some other more underrepresented areas of this time. I'm going to cover some basic history on the Romani, which the movie chose to call them with the G word. I'll cover some basic history on Leonardo da Vinci, because he's always fun. Then a very quick history on chocolate, particularly its introduction in the 16th century. And finally, I will bum you all out with a woefully inadequate summary of the transatlantic slave trade and its impact on 16th century France. And I'll throw in some nice little niblets at the end from actual outtakes from the main episode. I'll put them either at the end or after the end credits, so always check that part out. Now, when discussing the Romani, I'm going to refer to them as the Romani, the Roma people, obviously the Wanderers and other names that they've been called will probably be in there depending on what part of history I'm discussing. According to official sources, the Roma people arrived in France in the late 1410s, mostly in Provence, Flanders, and Alsace. Their first appearance in Paris was reported in 1427. Back then, they were usually called Bohemians or Egyptians because they believed that that's where they came from. Bohemians, they called them Bohemians, particularly because the king of Bohemia gave them protection letters from that historical region in the Czech Republic, or supposedly. And then also they were called Egyptians because some of them came from a place called Little Egypt, which is a territory in the old Byzantine Empire. So they that because of their different migrations, that's how they ended up with being called gypsies. And they moved through because they were fleeing the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. But they were all distinct cultures and different groups, of course, influenced by their previous settlements in Italy and Germany and Byzantium. And so because of all of that, their settlement in France was actually particularly diverse. At first, they were mostly welcome due to several factors. They were supposedly helpful in medieval society as they offered services like being mercenaries to counts, dukes, and other princes of that feudalist era. They also worked as artists and merchants themselves, and their nomadic way of life lended them to be accepted in society because most merchants and mercenaries and all those other professions lended themselves to being itinerant. Despite this and being accepted at the start, they quickly faced discrimination, and because of their particular practices as fortune tellers and performing divination and giving spectacles of dancing. And of course, because they were often mercenaries, they sometimes caused issues with, kidnappings and killings and everything else that mercenaries are often hired to do. And of course, eventually that led to further discrimination and ousting from areas, much like every other non-white, non-Christian group in France faced at that time. And then this led to legal discrimination. So in 1539, Francois I published a law to expel Bohemians out of France. But because of the mercenary ties between the Roma and the local aristocracy, kind of conflicted under Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, his absolute monarchy, adopted a law in 1682. So during the latter part of the 17th century, there was a Franco-Dutch war that both France and the Dutch Republic needed thousands of men to fight. So of course they were like, oh look, the Romani people, we can use them. So so they actually rounded up quote-unquote vagrants and the poor to work the galleys and provide armies labor force. So the Roma quickly became targets for that. And then after the wars, in the first decade of the 18th century, Roma were killed with impunity throughout the Dutch Republic. And so many of them fled back to France, and it just was really bad all over Europe. And even some Roma could be kept as slaves in Wallachia and Moldavia until its abolition in 1856. Although the majority traveled as free nomads with their wagons, as alluded to in the spoked wheel symbol in the Romani flag. But elsewhere, including France, they were subjected to ethnic cleansing, abduction of their children, and forced labor. And as a result of all that, large groups of Roma moved east toward Poland, which was more tolerant, and to Russia, where the Roma were treated more fairly as long as they paid the annual taxes. And eventually they moved on to North America, and groups have been recorded in Virginia and French Louisiana. And there was a larger scale Roma emigration to the United States in the 1860s, particularly from Great Britain. And many of them also settled in South America. Now, one thing I will discuss real quick about where a lot of people ask, well, who are the Romani people? There's been a lot of speculation, and, obviously they were originally thought to be Egyptian or Romanian because of the confusion with the Romani name, but they're actually from most historical scholars, and some of the science is starting to show that they're actually from the Indian subcontinent, actually like in southern India, in particular the region of present-day Rajasthan. Their subsequent westward migration, which was probably in waves, occurred around 1000 CE. And the original name, Roma, actually comes from the Sanskrit word Doma, which means a member of a Dalit caste of traveling musicians and dancers. And we actually don't use the exonym, which is what other people call the Roma gypsies, because it is considered pejorative by some Romani due to its connotations of illegality and irregularity, as well as its historical use as a racial slur. And the attendees of the first World Romani Congress in 1971 unanimously voted to reject the use of all exonyms for the Romani, including gypsy. So that was a little poorly probably summarized history of the Romani in France, but I hopefully that gave a little more context for people. Now we'll move on to Leonardo da Vinci. So Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on April 15th, 1452. He was an Italian polymath of the High Renaissance and an active painter, draughtsman, engineer, scientist, theorist, sculptor, and architect. He is the quintessential Renaissance man. He was, like it was mentioned in the movie, he was born out of wedlock to a successful notary and lower class woman in or near Vinci in Italy, and he was educated in Florence by the Italian painter and sculptor Andrea del Verrocchio. His father was Piero da Vinci, full name Sir Piero da Vinci da Antonio di Ser Piero di Ser Guido, who lived from 1426 to 1504, and he was a Florentine legal notary, and his mother was Caterina di Miolippi, who was from the lower class. It remains uncertain about his whole upbringing and exactly where he was born, but what we do know is that his parents both married separately the year after his birth. His mother only appears in Leonardo's notes as Caterina or Catalina, but she may have been Caterina Butti del Vaca, who married the local artisan Antonio di Piero Butti del Vaca. And then his father married Albiera Amadori, and after her death in 1464, went on to have 3 more marriages. And from those marriages, Leonardo eventually had 16 half-siblings, of whom 11 actually survived infancy. And they were all much younger than him. The last was born when Leonardo was 46 years old, and he had very little contact with most of his siblings. So So he lived to be 67, which was fairly decent in those days. And his works they precede any discussion. So I'm just going to focus on what we saw in the movie. So as we discussed a bit in the movie, we first see the La Scapliegata, the painting that's supposedly of Daniel de Barbarac, and they kind of superimposed Drew Barrymore's face onto it. The most intriguing difference I see is that the actual painting has the woman actually kind of smiling, which I think was a missed opportunity given that Daniel de Barbarac was supposed to be a very hopeful and positive person. And we actually see Danielle growing up in the Chateau de la Russie, which was actually burned down in 1575 and reconstructed in 1600. And it's located Serlat in the Dordogne region of France. I'm doing my best with the French pronunciation, so please forgive me. And then obviously when Prince Henry meets Leonardo da Vinci on his way when he was trying to escape his arranged marriage, he goes after Leonardo's most precious possession, his life. We find out that this is the Mona Lisa. It's also noted that Leonardo going around dressed like a bum old lady wouldn't really be a thing. Leonardo was actually very into the courtly status of being an artist. He enjoyed that, so he probably would have had much more guards and more high status ways of getting around, basically. As we see Danielle getting dressed as well when she's on her way to go rescue her beloved servant, you can see in the interior, in the room there's actually a famous Leonardo drapery study. It looks like there's a drape over someone's legs and showing the shadows and the way the clothing sits. And in this room alone, when Danielle's getting dressed, we actually see a lot of Leonardo's kind of less famous paintings, I suppose, and his drapery studies. So there's like at least 2 or 3. So the thing about the Mona Lisa painting that we see, I doubt it would have been rolled up like that, let alone that it was way too large for the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is only like 30 by 21 inches. So it's painted on a wood panel, not a piece of parchment like they show here. So that was interesting, but they had to make it easy to move, I suppose. And then also have the reveal. Yeah. And then we eventually get to see when Leonardo first meets Danielle, when she's swimming in the river, he's testing out his water shoes, which look like small boats on his feet. And this is actually from his Codex Atlanticus. I think I mentioned this in the main episode. And we also see the kite, a flying machine, which is also from that same notebook. And we even catch a glimpse of his armillary sphere and a giant wooden model of his polyhedron, all based on illustrations for Luca Pacioli's De Divina Proportione. The big question, of course, is like, how did he get them out in the middle of nowhere? He traveled, did he suddenly build them while he was lots of questions, but I think it's mostly just for reference points, little Easter eggs for us, as we call them now, for us to glimpse and the amazing talent and imagination of Leonardo da Vinci. And then we obviously also see later on that Leonardo's hard at work working on his famous portrait of her, and we get to see 3 different versions. As a side note, it's been noted that Pierre Le Fou, the kind of villain guy toward the end of the movie, it's striking how much he looks like one of the portraits of Henry III, who he was the last Valois king of France and had a reputation for being a sleaze bucket and wore a lot of black and a single gold earring. Very interesting. So those are just some of the things that could be noticed. And Leonardo da Vinci is fascinating. And of course, we do know that he passed away in France. These were definitely his last years when he came over to France and was in the court of Francois I. course, he died on May 2nd, 1519 at age 67. And it should be noted that, as I mentioned in the episode, this was all out of order. He died before Utopia would have been, by Thomas More, would have been famous. So Leonardo died at Clos Louche and possibly of a stroke. Francois I had become a close friend, and that he actually possibly held Leonardo's head in his arms as he died, but that may be legend rather than fact. His student Melzi was the principal heir and executor. Along with any money he had, his paintings, tools, library, and personal effects all went to him. And his other longtime pupil and companion Salai and his servant Baptista de Vilinas each received half of Leonardo's vineyards. His brothers received land, and his serving woman received a fur-lined cloak. On August 12th, Leonardo's remains were interred in the Collegiate Church of St. Florentine at Château d'Amboise, and they're not sure if his remains are still in the same place, as the Château d'Amboise was very much destroyed, mostly destroyed during the French Revolution. And during his lifetime, he was very private about his personal life, and which might have been for good reason. There is speculation that he was gay, which would be great, as he appeared to have no close relationships with women except for his friendship with Cecilia Galeriani and the two Este sisters, Beatrice and Isabella. And obviously Melzi and Salai, his two most favored pupils, and they may have also been his lovers. It's hard to say. We know that Leonardo made a list of Salai's misdemeanors, calling him a thief, a liar, stubborn, and a glutton, after he stole money and sometimes spent fortunes on clothes. But Leonardo continued to indulge him, and he was in his household for 30 years. And it is said in 1476, court records actually showed when Leonardo was about 24 that he and 3 other young men were charged with sodomy, as it was called then, and it involved a male sex worker. The charges were dismissed for lack of evidence, as they often were back then, but speculation, since one of the accused, Leonardo de Tornabuoni, was related to Lorenzo de' Medici, the family exerted its influence to secure the dismissal. Since that day, much has been written about Leonardo's presumed homosexuality and its role in art, and particularly the androgyny and eroticism manifested in St. John the Baptist and Bacchus and his more erotic drawings. But obviously we'll never know, but it's there. We'll move on from there. So that's my bit on Leonardo da Vinci. And so we'll move on to chocolate. Real kind of quick there. They do mention chocolate in the movie. Would have been extremely new at that time in the early 1500s. We see Henry feeding one of the stepsisters chocolate, saying, "The Spanish monks keep sending bricks of it." So yes, the Spanish were responsible for bringing chocolate to France and kind of sharing it around their missionaries. And it was very popular in France and caused the rise of several chocolate houses. But there wouldn't be any bricks of chocolate. Solid chocolate was developed 2 centuries later by the British and mastered by the Swiss, who made milk chocolate, which is my favorite. So either she would have been drinking it or eating a cocoa bean or the seed. But in any of those things, she wouldn't be finding it sinful because the seeds and the beans were bitter without sugar. Chocolate, as many would know, which is what we reference as dark chocolate, is very bitter without any sugar helping. And in any case, shipping to France would not have been done by the Spanish, as the Spanish kept it a secret for a century or so. Obviously, cocoa has a rich history spanning over 5,000 years. When the Spanish invaded and colonized Mesoamerica, they encountered the Mayan and Aztec cultures, and they would make zocolato, which was a spiced drink. They had a very interesting way of heating up. They kind of like drank it like coffee in a way, and it was very popular in those cultures. And then Columbus introduced cocoa to Europe on his 4th voyage, and Hernan Cortez, that asshole, brought the Aztec recipe to Spain in 1521. And it was the Spaniards who started sweetening that drink with sugar and honey and turning it into a luxurious, basically hot cocoa. And that was initially limited to Spanish elites, but it quickly spread through the royal courts of Europe and was eventually introduced to the public in the 17th century. And by then, Dutch merchants dominated the global cocoa trade, and Linnaeus, who studied plants, named the cocoa cocoa tree Theobroma, meaning food of the gods. And then finally in the 19th century, so the 1800s, it revolutionized the cocoa production like it did everything else. And in 1828, Dutchman Conrad Johannes van Houten patented a method to press most of the fat from cocoa mass, creating cocoa powder and butter. And he introduced the alkalization to improve the flavor and the color. And these innovations paved the way for Englishman John Fry, who developed finally solid chocolate in 1847, which was a smoother and richer alternative to cocoa drinks. And as we all know, Swiss chemist Henry Nestle later invented milk chocolate in 1875, and the wrapped chocolate bar was another Dutch contribution. These advancements transformed cocoa into its now global sensation, and it's a cherished ingredient in countless products. Now on to all the bummer portion of this episode, the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, not going to cover the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade in this episode. I'm sure there's entire multi-episodic podcasts and history shows for you to watch on that devastation. But so I'm going to try to focus on France and basically what was going on in the early 1500s. So as I said in the episode, the slave trades of the European world were ramping up during this time, the early 1500s, and France joined in quite heartily when they started using quote-unquote criminals to send them over to the Americas, as was kind of alluded to a few times in the movie. But they were already looking at African peoples to trade. The debtors and criminals were their start in the colonial hijinks, as it were. One question we kind of got stuck on during the movie was like, did France compensate their prisoners going to the Americas? No. I knew that might be the answer, but no. During that time, France, like other European powers, they used transportation to remove criminals and vagrants from their site and sent them to North America and New France. There were private merchants who would contract with sheriffs and pay jail fees and other costs to basically buy those prisoners and take them with them to use as labor. And then they would also become prisoners to the merchants and others, basically in a form of indentured servitude. So not really slaves, but they would become indentured servants and essentially sold for their labor to other colonists. And that system actually lasted well into the 1600s. So from our understanding is that the beginning of African slavery in the continental British colonies is often marked by the arrival of a group of about 20 Africans to Virginia in 1619. And then the European practice of using slave labor in the New World is older and obviously very complex, and beginning with Columbus's voyage in 1492. Slavery was viewed as an indispensable source of labor, and the practice was already a part of the social and economic construct of Spain and Portugal, all noted previous colonies of Rome who loved slavery. And then initially in Columbus's trading center of Hispaniola, the native Arawak Indians were enslaved, and it became common across North and South America for the Spanish, French, and Danish settlers. The Spanish first enslaved the Taino in Puerto Rico in the early 1500s, and Indian slavery persisted in North America all the way into the Civil War, along with African slaves. And it only decreased because of the decimation of the native indigenous population by those European diseases and people. Interestingly, as a side note, the first African to set foot in the present-day United States was likely a free man, Juan Garrido, who accompanied Juan Ponce de Leon to Puerto Rico in 1508 and Florida in 1513. The first African slave probably arrived in Puerto Rico in 1513, making it likely the first place in the current United States where African slaves were held, though slavery didn't become a significant labor economy until the 18th century. So enslaved peoples in early French Louisiana, which obviously a French colony, was particularly in New Orleans and in Mobile, and it had a complex cultural heritage due to the changes in rulership by the Spanish and British. The Haitian Revolution in the 1790s also brought free French-speaking people of color to the region, leading to the development of the Creole culture. So, and with Native American and African slavery being very intertwined, it was actually indigenous indigenous people who helped escaped African slaves. There's an example of a slave shipwreck off St. Vincent in 1675, which led to the indigenous Kalinago people intermarrying with the rescued Africans who became the Garifuna. And in Florida, under Spanish control until 1822, that became a refuge for escaped slaves who formed alliances with the Seminole and Miccosukee Indians, leading to the brutal Seminole Wars. Treaties with Indian groups such as the Choctaw also sometimes offered refuge to escaped slaves. And the rich culture of French-speaking African Americans, primarily in Louisiana, Texas, and Alabama, greatly contributed to the musical traditions like Zydeco. Documentation of former slaves, such as the Gula-speaking Wallace Quarterman from the Sea Islands, provides personal accounts of emancipation. Highly recommend looking that up. So while the British dominated the transatlantic slave trade to their continental colonies, the French were the third largest slave traders, primarily delivering Africans to the lucrative French Caribbean colonies like Saint Dominique, which is now known as Haiti. Very, very brief summary on that, but it's kind of where it developed from. So what we were seeing in the movie, to tie it back, is the beginnings of their indentured servitude and slavery economy, basically. The French definitely took part in all of that. And no, they didn't compensate their prisoners. So thank you again for listening to Celluloid Chronicles, a historical movie podcast. We really appreciate you still being here, and thank you for continuing to join us on our journey. Our next main episode will be coming out hopefully soon. It's going to be on Killers of the Flower Moon, which is a very large topic, and we want to do it justice as best we can without going overboard. It's a fine balance. So stay tuned, and please like and subscribe to us wherever you listen, and we hope you join us again soon. And always remember, live like you're making history.